Once upon a time, Jeep and their parent company Chrysler used to use the term Grand to indicate the bigger version of something, like a Voyager and a Grand Voyager, a Caravan and a Grand Caravan, a Cherokee and a Grand Cherokee. But those days are over. Now the term for longer is L. So we have a Grand Cherokee and a Grand Cherokee L, that's the longer Grand Cherokee. And now we're going to have a Wagoneer and a Grand Wagoneer and a Wagoneer L and a Grand Wagoneer L. And you guessed it, the L version is even longer than the already very long Wagoneer. Awkward naming scheme aside, this is the biggest and grandest SUV that Jeep has ever produced. It's also likely going to be the most expensive. And even more important than that, this is debuting a new engine lineup for Jeep, and an engine lineup that we probably will be seeing under the hood of more than just upcoming Jeep SUVs. But let's talk about the stretch first. What Jeep did to create the new Grand Wagoneer L and the Wagoneer L, again, I think these four names are a little bit confusing, is they stretched the wheelbase by 7 inches and then they stretched the body by 12 inches. So there is a slightly longer overhang in the rear. That's basically what we see in competitive extended wheelbase models. The additional stretch further separates the flagship of the Jeep brand from other vehicles that you might want to be cross-shopping against it, like an extended wheelbase Range Rover that is considerably smaller inside and outside. The Lexus LX, considerably smaller on the inside and outside, BMW X7, Mercedes-Benz GLS, etc., 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 all considerably smaller. But the interesting twist with the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer is that when they stretch them, they don't move the rear seats further backward like we do find in the Escalade. Now, in the Escalade, they don't move the rear seats too far backwards. Most of the additional stretch does go to the cargo area, but in the Navigator and in the Grand Wagoneer and Wagoneer, the entire stretch goes to the cargo area. When Jeep first launched the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer, there was some talk that maybe Jeep would not make an extended wheelbase version because they already slotted the short wheelbase version somewhere between worlds. It is notably longer than a regular Escalade or a regular Yukon or Tahoe, but not quite as long as the Escalade ESV. But interestingly enough, this new extended wheelbase version is almost exactly the same size as the big Escalade. With the additional length comes a bigger gas tank. It's about 4 gallons larger, so it should go longer on a tank, and more efficient engines, which I'm going to get to here in a moment. But about the interior dimensions, the seats don't move, so we get about 2 inches less combined legroom than we find in the longest version of the Cadillac, but a little bit more third row room. To be honest, the interior here is so large, nobody's really going to miss those 2 inches. And the third row is still likely going to be more comfortable than the Escalade ESV. The big reason to buy the L model over the non-L model is for the increased cargo room. Instead of 27.4 cubic feet behind the third row, which was already class-leading for a short wheelbase model, you get a class-leading 44.2 cubic feet. That is definitely an enormous cargo area back there. That is definitely well ahead of the average minivan in America, and significantly ahead of something like the 3-row Grand Cherokee. So if you're looking at a 3-row vehicle that you really need to be able to seat 7 or 8 people in, and perhaps 6 or 7 people's worth of luggage behind, this is the kind of vehicle you're going to want to look at. Alternatively, if you want to carry a ton of cargo or maybe a large water heater and still be able to seat 5, you can do that with over 88 cubic feet of storage capacity behind the second row seats. Jeep has released a ton of interesting specifications on the new Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer L, but the most interesting of them is that the base model is only 109 pounds heavier than the V8 short wheelbase model, and that's because of the new engine under the hood. The Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer L are going to debut a new inline 6 engine. This is loosely based off of the 4-cylinder turbo that we find currently under the hood of the Jeep Cherokee, the Grand Cherokee 4xe, and a number of other models like the Wrangler. But obviously things have definitely been cranked up to the next level for the new inline 6. And this is the engine that I would not be surprised if we find in relatively short order under the hood from everything from a Ram pickup truck all the way to a Dodge Charger, Dodge Challenger, Grand Cherokee, etc. The new 3-liter twin-turbo inline-6 engine is going to come in 2 different power levels. The less powerful option is going to be found in the Wagoneer, and the more powerful option in the Grand Wagoneer, of course. The less powerful of these 2 engines produces 420 horsepower and 468 pound-feet of torque. That is definitely a healthy bump over the 5.7-liter V8, especially when we take a look at that torque figure. And more importantly, versus the V8, the torque comes on much lower and stays on much higher, so it has a much broader torque curve than you'll find in a naturally aspirated V8 engine. It's mated to a standard 8-speed automatic transmission and, of course, 4-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive. According to Jeep, that engine is not only going to be lighter than the outgoing 5.7-liter V8, it's also going to be more efficient, up to 15% more efficient with lower emissions. So you can expect a 1 to 2 mpg bump in the Wagoneer. If you're not a fan of buying expensive gasoline, you'll be happy to know that the base version of the inline 6 will run on regular unleaded. The more powerful version of this engine will be found standard in the Grand Wagoneer L and optional in the short wheelbase Grand Wagoneer. It's going to produce a whopping 510 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. So this is probably going to be the swiftest entry in this segment until we see the more powerful engine coming soon under the hood of the Escalade. Now, Jeep hasn't made any promises when it comes to fuel economy for this engine, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was more efficient than the 6.4-liter V8 that we find standard in the short wheelbase model. Aside from the engine upgrade, everything else about the Wagoneer L and the Grand Wagoneer L is basically the stretched version of the short wheelbase model. So we have the excellent interior, tons of screens on the inside, the passenger side screen, massaging seats up front, tons of features for the rear seat passengers as well. We just get that bigger cargo area in the back. Be sure and let me know what you think about the look down there in the comments section. I was a little bit concerned that the stretched version might look funky because sometimes stretching a wheelbase in a vehicle can look a little peculiar, especially when we have a really long overhang in the back, as we've seen in certain previous versions of the Tahoe and Suburban pairing, for instance. But as we see, I think, in the current generation Escalade, I think they've done a good job making the stretch work with the design. This design still definitely has that station wagon, family mobile-like really long window behind the rear doors, but there aren't too many good ways around that. Jeep has not announced pricing just yet, but right now the Cadillac Escalade is about $3,000 more expensive if you want the long wheelbase version versus the short wheelbase version, and you can expect Jeep to stick pretty close to that formula or perhaps be a little bit more expensive. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe the more expensive model was about a $4,000 bump or so. Hopefully I will be driving one of these very, very soon, so be sure and hit that subscribe button down there if you haven't already done so, enable notifications, and I'll see all of you just as soon as I can get my hands on the new Wagoneer L and Grand Wagoneer L. That name still just doesn't work quite right in my head, I have to say. I would really love it if it was just Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer. That would make more sense to me. Let me know what you think about that as well. I'll see all of you later.